Welcome to our deep dive, and today we're going to be looking into the life and times of Empress Dowager Cixi. She's one of the most, powerful and controversial figures in Chinese history, and what we're going to try to do is unpack her story using just one source, her Wikipedia entry, and see if we can get a real sense of who she was and how she wielded power for almost half a century.
It's amazing what you can find in a single Wikipedia entry. When you really start to dig into it, we're not just after the dates and names here.
Right.
We really want to find those juicy details, the surprising facts, the things that make Cixi's story come alive.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's start with the origin story. Cixi wasn't born an empress. She wasn't even born a princess. She came from a noble Manchu family, but rose through the ranks of the imperial harem, becoming a concubine to the Xianfeng emperor. And it was giving birth to the emperor's only surviving son that really changed her trajectory.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Cixi was highly intelligent
Oh.
and literate, which was unusual for Manchu women of that era. And this gave her a distinct advantage. She was able to advise the emperor, read palace memorials,
Yeah.
and basically get a crash course in running an empire, while other concubines were focused on courtly duties.
So when Xianfeng dies in 1861, leaving a young heir, a huge power vacuum, Cixi is ready to make her move.
Oh, yeah.
She sees her opportunity and she seizes it.
Yeah, this is a moment that's just ripe with drama.
Yeah.
You have the 8 regents that are appointed by the late emperor, all men, and they're thinking that they're going to be the ones calling the shots. But Cixi, along with Empress Dowager Xin, who is Xianfeng's widow, they outsmart them all in what's known as the Xinyu coup.
The Xinyu coup, tell me more about that.
So the Xinyu coup was basically this cunning power grab, Xinhingxi and Xin. They formed secret alliances, they accused the regents of corruption, and ultimately they managed to seize control. As co-regents for the young Tongzi emperor, it's really a testament to Cixi's political savvy and her ability to manipulate those around her.
It's almost Shakespearean. You have this woman who, according to tradition, wasn't supposed to have any political power, outmaneuvering a whole council of powerful men. But it wasn't just about ambition for Cixi, was it? She also had to deal with a China that was facing some serious challenges at the time.
Absolutely. Imagine the weight of the world on her shoulders. You have the Taiping Rebellion raging across the country, the bureaucracy is riddled with corruption, and foreign powers are encroaching on China's sovereignty. Cixi had to be decisive, and she had to be strong.
So how did she handle all of that? Did she just double down on the traditional ways of doing things?
Well, actually, that's what's so fascinating about Cixi. She could be incredibly pragmatic, even breaking with tradition when it suited her. For example, she recognized the talent and experience of Han Chinese officials, like Zhang Wufan, who played a key role in quelling the Taiping Rebellion. And this was a significant departure from that Manchu-centric power structure of the time.
So she's this mix of tradition and pragmatism. Was she a reformer at heart? Did she embrace modernization?
Well, it's more complicated than that. She oversaw the Tongzi Restoration, which was a period of significant reform and modernization. She backed new technologies, military reforms, even the creation of a foreign languages school. But her support for progress had limits, especially when it threatened her authority or clashed with her deeply held beliefs.
Right, and that's where we get that famous story about her rejecting railways because they were too noisy for the ancestral tombs. Talk about a clash of worldviews.
Yeah, that perfectly illustrates the tensions that Cixi faced between trying to modernize China while also preserving its traditions. It wasn't always a smooth or a consistent process.
So we have this incredibly powerful woman ruling from behind the curtain, navigating these massive challenges, and trying to figure out how to move China forward. But let's not forget the human element here. She was also a mother. What about her relationship with her son, the Tongji Emperor? Was it all smooth sailing?
Not exactly. The Tongzi Emperor's story is actually quite tragic. He was thrust into power at a very young age, and his relationship with Cixi was well complicated. Cixi, being the ultimate power broker, had her own ideas about who her son should marry, and she wasn't too fond of his choice, Empress Arut.
Ooh, sounds like some palace intrigue is brewing. What happened?
Well, there are rumors that Cixi blamed Arut for driving Tongzi into what were considered less than imperial pursuits.
You mean he liked to party a little too much? Was he rebelling against his mother's control?
There's certainly speculation along those lines, and then of course there's the mystery surrounding Arut's death shortly after Tongzi's passing. Was it a coincidence, or was something more sinister at play?
The plot thickens. It's so hard to separate fact from fiction when it comes to Cixi, but that's part of what makes her story so captivating. So we've got a power-hungry yet pragmatic Empress Dowager, a rebellious son who met an unfortunate end, and a whole lot of palace intrigue. Where do we go from here?
Well, with Tongzi's death, another succession crisis arises. And Cixi, ever the master strategist, isn't about to relinquish her grip on power. This is where her nephew, the Guangxu emperor, enters the picture. But things are about to get even more complicated.
Last time we left off with Cixi choosing her nephew Guangxu to become the new emperor, it sounds like she wasn't quite ready to give up being the one in charge.
Oh yeah, Cixi definitely had a knack for consolidating power. Guangxu was only 4 years old when he ascended to the throne, so that meant that Cixi continued to rule as regent. It's really fascinating how she was able to maintain this control even as Guangxu got older.
Didn't he have to address her as dear father? That's a pretty strong reminder of who's really in charge.
Exactly. Imagine the psychological impact of having to address your aunt as dear father. It really speaks volumes about the power dynamic at play.
And then there's the death of Empress Dowager in 1881. With her co-regent out of the picture, Cixi became the sole power behind the throne.
Yeah. Cixi's death did raise some eyebrows. While there's no concrete evidence of foul play, the timing certainly fueled speculation. Especially considering Cixi's history of, let's just say, eliminating political rivals.
Cixi was definitely not someone you wanted to cross. But it's also important to remember that she was leading China through a period of just immense change and upheaval. The world was rapidly modernizing, and she couldn't ignore that.
Right, and that's where we see that duality of Cixi. On the one hand, she initiated reforms like the self-strengthening movement, which, included establishing shipyards, arsenals, modern military academies. But on the other hand, she could be really resistant to changes that threatened her authority or contradicted traditional beliefs.
It's like she was trying to steer a massive ship through a narrow strait, constantly adjusting course to avoid crashing on the rocks of either stagnation or radical reform.
That's a great analogy. And it's important to note that Cixi wasn't the only one grappling with these issues. A lot of Chinese intellectuals and officials were also debating the best way forward for China.
So how did Guangxu fit into all of this? Was he content to be a puppet ruler?
Not at all. As Guangxu matured, he became increasingly influenced by reformist thinkers, like Kang Yue, who advocated for sweeping changes. To modernize China's government and society, they wanted to transform China into a constitutional monarchy, which was a very radical idea at the time.
And how did Cixi react to these ideas?
Well, she saw them as a direct threat to her power and the stability of the Qing dynasty. Remember, she had lived through the Taiping Rebellion, which had nearly toppled the empire. So she was very wary of any change that could lead to chaos.
So it was a clash of ideologies, the young, reform-minded emperor versus the aging conservative Empress Dowager. What happened next?
In 1898, Guangxu, emboldened by the support of reformers, launched what's known as the 100 Days Reform. It was a whirlwind of change. He issued edicts aimed at overhauling China's education system, modernizing the economy, and even restructuring the government.
Sounds like he was trying to push China into the 20th century.
He was. But it was all too much too fast. The reforms were met with resistance from conservative officials, and Cixi saw her opportunity to reassert control.
And she didn't hesitate to seize it?
No, she didn't. Cixi staged a coup, placed Guangxu under house arrest, and effectively ended the 100 Days Reform. It was a brutal crackdown. 6 prominent reformers were executed, and many others were imprisoned or exiled.
So Guangxu's hopes for a modern China were crushed, and Cixi's grip on power tightened even further. But then just a few years later, China was plunged into yet another crisis, the Boxer Rebellion.
Yeah, the Boxer Rebellion was a violent anti-foreign uprising that was fueled by resentment towards Western influence in China. The Boxers, who believed that they possessed mystical powers, attacked foreigners and Chinese Christians, causing widespread chaos.
And what was Cixi's role in all of this?
Initially, she was hesitant, but as the Boxer movement gained momentum, she saw an opportunity to exploit it for her own purposes. She declared war on the Western powers, hoping to use the Boxers to expel foreign influence from China.
It seemed like a very risky gamble. Did it pay off?
It backfired spectacularly. The 8-nation alliance, comprised of Western powers and Japan, swiftly crushed the Boxer Rebellion. They occupied Beijing, looted the Forbidden City, and imposed a humiliating treaty on the Qing government.
So Cixi's attempt to use the Boxers to strengthen her position ultimately weakened the dynasty even further.
Exactly. The Boxer Rebellion really marked a turning point for Cixi and for China. It exposed the Qing dynasty's vulnerability and the growing gap between China and the modern world.
So what happened to Cixi after this devastating defeat? Did she just give up?
You could say she had a change of heart, faced with the reality of China's precarious position. Cixi, in the final years of her life, began to embrace reforms that she had previously resisted.
Wow, it's amazing how she was able to adapt, even after decades in power.
It speaks to her pragmatism and her desire, above all else, to preserve the Qing dynasty, even if it meant abandoning some of her long-held beliefs.
So after decades of resisting change, Cixi in her final years embarks on this path of reform. It's a fascinating twist in her story.
It is, yeah. It's almost like the Box Rebellion was like a wake-up call for her. The defeat was so humiliating, so devastating, that it really forced her to confront the reality of China's situation. The old ways weren't working. Something had to change.
So what kind of reforms did she implement?
Well, she sent delegations of officials abroad to study constitutional monarchies in Japan and Europe. She abolished the traditional civil service exam, which had been like the bedrock of the Chinese bureaucracy for centuries. And she even considered establishing a parliament.
Wow, that's a huge shift for someone who once rejected railways because they were too noisy for the ancestors.
Right, it really shows how adaptable Cixi could be. She realized that clinging to the past wasn't going to save China. She had to embrace, at least to some extent, the changes that were sweeping the world.
It makes you wonder what she could accomplish if she had embraced these reforms earlier. But then again, maybe these changes wouldn't have been possible without the shock of the Boxer Rebellion.
That's a good point. Sometimes it takes a crisis to shake things up and force people to see things in a new light. But unfortunately for Cixi and for China, time was running out.
In 1908, both Cixi and the Guangxu emperor died within days of each other. What are the chances?
The timing is certainly suspicious. And it gets even more intriguing when you consider that forensic testing done centuries later revealed that Guangxu died from acute arsenic poisoning.
Hold on, are you suggesting that Cixi had him poisoned?
Well, it's a theory that some historians have put forward. They argue that Cixi, knowing that her own death was imminent, wanted to ensure that her vision for China, her reforms, would continue after she was gone. She couldn't risk Guangxu undoing everything she had worked for.
That's a chilling thought. But I guess it wouldn't be out of character for someone who is so ruthless in her pursuit of power.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that we're dealing with historical speculation here. There's no definitive proof that Cixi ordered Guangxu's poisoning. But the possibility certainly adds another layer of complexity to her already complicated story.
So after this deep dive into her Wikipedia entry, what can we say about Cixi? Was she a villain, a hero, a tragic figure?
I think it's too simplistic to try to categorize her in any one of those terms. You know, Cixi was a product of her time, a woman who rose to power in a patriarchal society and ruled China during one of the most turbulent periods in its history.
She was definitely a survivor. She faced rebellions, foreign invasions, internal power struggles, and she always managed to come out on top.
Yeah, she was also a pragmatist. She was willing to adapt, to change, even to contradict her own beliefs if she thought it would benefit China. And in her final years, she initiated reforms that laid the groundwork for the modern Chinese state.
But let's not forget the darker side of her legacy. She could be ruthless, manipulative, and even cruel. She was responsible for the deaths of many of her opponents, and her actions often had devastating consequences for the people of China.
It's all part of the tapestry of her life, the good and the bad, the triumphs and the tragedies. And ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide how they view Cixi. Was she a force for progress or an obstacle to change? A brilliant strategist or a power-hungry despot?
I think that's the beauty of history. It's not always black and white. It's full of shades of gray. And it's up to us to grapple with those complexities, to weigh the evidence, and to draw our own conclusions.
Exactly. And that's what we've tried to do today. With this deep dive into Cixi's Wikipedia entry, we haven't provided all the answers, but we've hopefully given you the tools to continue exploring her story and to form your own opinion about this fascinating and controversial figure.
So what will you take away from this deep dive? Will you see Cixi as a shrewd politician who navigated a treacherous landscape, or as a ruthless tyrant who clung to power at any cost? The answer, like so much of history, is open to interpretation. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep discovering the hidden depths of the past.